Hello everyone, my name is Steve Kemish. I'm Senior Independent Director on the board and also Chair of the Finance Committee for Table Tennis England. This recording is for those that couldn't make the AGM or who could and would like to go back through the financial report from that event. 7 slides for me to go through for you, and we'll start with the one on screen, which talks about the financial impact of COVID-19. As you might expect in a year ravaged by the pandemic, income and expenditure were both significantly down on budget. However, not on all areas. For example, membership income was reduced by 39% compared to the original forecast, but the expenditure only by 7%. This in the main was because there were many costs that were not impacted by the pandemic, such as staff and systems, as well as diverting effort into continuing membership support and advisory services. It's worth noting that we're in the final year of our 4-year phasing and funding cycle from Sport England, and therefore planned headcount reductions were there in a few areas. Happily, we didn't need to make those due to things like the furlough scheme, so we've kept those staff, not only to allow us to do more this year, but it will also allow us to benefit in future years from savings where we don't need to rehire those people as the phasing of those budgets change and numbers hopefully go up. That government scheme enabled us to collect £108,000 in furlough money to cover staff that are usually supported by areas such as membership income. This allowed us to use the flexible furlough system so we could use staff where required to support the wider membership throughout the year, including support services, and where able to run competitions. Wherever possible, we've also looked to reduce expenditure in all areas. This has included holding committee meetings and other events remotely, reducing travel costs, as well as savings from things like office rent. Many of these changes will be ongoing process that we can adopt for future years to continue to make savings. As you can see from on screen, there are 3 areas that were originally above the budget, which included extra support for clubs, as well as providing equipment to help people keep engaged in table tennis and active during the stay-at-home guidelines. Although physical opportunities have been reduced, we were able to provide a virtual opportunity instead, which still incurred some costs overall, with the support of those members that renewed in 2021 and the Corona Job Retention Scheme, plus flexibility from Sport England with their funding, we were able to just about break even. No mean feat. If we look at the second slide around income, as you can see, obviously was a lot less in 2021, not only due to the pandemic, but in terms of previous years, again, where we are in the cycle with our main contributor, Sport England. In fact, you can see it's been decreasing steadily since around 2016-17. So the question is, what have we been doing about this? Well, commercially, we've been looking at how we can become more of an attractive package to sponsors and corporate supporters. Progress on this was abruptly halted by the pandemic, but we will look to commence this work soon. We've also looked at support from non-traditional sport funders, i.e. health and housing, where table tennis can benefit the outcomes there, and we can offer them with equipment and wider services. We also look to reduce costs and also make table tennis infrastructure more sustainable, such as TTE, and to support clubs and leagues, and working hard to develop and support the volunteer infrastructure, as well as programs like TTE Kids. If we look at our third slide, which is around core funding, you'll see a similar shape to the previous slide. As an organisation, we are reliant heavily on Sport England funding. You may well already know this. We are in that 4-year award agreement that I mentioned earlier that tends to taper down towards that period. We received the funding from Sport England from 2 different sources: the government via the Exchequer and also the National Lottery, which historically has included ring-fence funding for specific projects such as talent and mass participation. There is, of course, a lot of uncertainty around Brexit and the impact of the pandemic as we move forward. There are no guarantees regarding funding, and sport must be really prepared for financial challenges. Lottery sales are down, meaning the amount of income support can get and we can be given may well be reduced. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, Sport England have extended our grant funding to March 2022, effectively making it a 5-year rather than 4-year cycle. They've also provided a great degree of flexibility to help the organisation and sport recover after the pandemic, although that flexibility is yet to be agreed and what that will look like. The interesting upside of all of this is that many other sports and organisations who are heavily reliant on corporate funding or sponsorship have had much harder times than us, resulting in much more of a loss in terms of staff and other core services. Table Tennis England does not have a particularly large percentage of corporate involvement at the moment, relatively speaking. So therefore we were slightly insulated from that risk during the pandemic period. Slide 4 looks at income. Whilst, as I mentioned on the previous slide, it's clear that the vast majority of that income, some 68%, comes from Sport England. Pandemic caused us to generate revenue at lower levels than we'd expect in other areas. This included membership, as I've already mentioned, but also into terms of competitions and our own core income. Whilst we generate that income, much of it is directly linked to expenditure around areas such as coaching courses, running camps, sales of loot tables, and so on. To put this into context, affiliation fees, our biggest income stream after Sport England last year, was 13% compared to 10.2% this year. Sport England represented 60% in the previous year, 68% on screen for this year. Our own income was pretty static, as you can see, at 9.44% compared to a previous year of 9%. However, of that tranche, 108,000 came from the coronavirus job retention or furlough scheme. Where does the money go? So expenditure, a mixed bag. Most of the expenditure takes place, as you'd expect and hope, directly in the delivery of the sport, i.e. around development, mass participation, competitions and talent, with back office supporting all of those. The amount of membership support service only takes into account the cost of membership staff and Sport AT/TT leagues. It does not include other services such as meetings, insurance, communications, other staff time supporting the membership. Spend in development, up from 26 to 28%. This is around areas such as return to play, guidance throughout the pandemic, grants, etc. Over 50% in total is spent on paid player members. So that's around development, competitions, performance, talent, and membership support services. Both income and expenditure were impacted during the coronavirus, as I've already stated, but we did make some savings on areas such as office rent, virtual meetings, travel expenses, as well as events that usually make a loss, of course, running a lot less during the last year. If we then look at the spend in terms of where that goes directly to the development of grassroots, you'll see that the actual pattern looks as if we peaked a number of years ago in terms of the absolute amount spent per year in this area. However, if you link to budget and expand it as a percentage of overall budget, you see a slightly different pattern. If you look at 13-14, you can see it was actually 14% of budget. In the highest looking year on the table, 18-19, 24%. But in the current year just ended, it was actually 29% of the total budget. So although down in absolute terms, it was the highest of all of these years. Since the change in strategy to focus on the development department has changed for increasing numbers in table tennis. Therefore, since the change in strategy, the focus has been on trying to get the core of the sport to include both staff time investment in programs such as BTT, TT Kids, etc. Due to the tapering down of the Sport England award towards the end of the 4-year cycle, expenditure has obviously had to reflect this. But even the pandemic meant we still spent over 787,000 on grassroots development. The last slide for this today is a question we're often asked, which is, where does my membership money go? The above provides information based on the fees we received in the year 1920. The reason we show this rather than 2021 was it's down by 46% and maybe a slightly different and hopefully a one-off pattern. You can see how it splits amongst a number of core areas, and the biggest pot, support services, that effectively goes back into running all aspects of the game when it comes to supporting members. We also require systems. There's a small element around things like governance and committee, performance, membership services, so those areas such as insurance, safeguarding, etc., core areas, and then competitions that, as I mentioned on the previous slide, often needs to be underwritten as they stand. The last thing I'd like to say is a thank you. The coronavirus retention scheme helped us. That 108,000 was a contributing factor towards breaking even, but the membership fees received also greatly helped support us to keep the sport running as we made that break-even position in a time of real test. So on behalf of the whole Table Tennis England team, I'd like to thank a few individuals, particularly the finance team led by Sam Gary, who's done such a brilliant job of managing budget in a very trying time. And also personally to Doug Livingston, who was the outgoing head of the finance committee, who's just finished serving his 4-year tenure on the board. I wish Doug all the very best and thank him and Sam for all the work they've done to keep the lights on and to keep the ship on an even keel.